I was 38 years old the night I learned my mother had priced my grandmother's whole life at $415,000 and hadn't thought to mention it until the pie. I draft trust documents for a living. I know what a signature is worth before a jury does. So when my mother set down her wine glass, smiled the smile she saves for winning, and said, "We finally sold Grandma's house," I didn't gasp. I didn't drop my fork. I did what I always do when something doesn't add up. I asked what closed. This is the story of a house, a trust nobody bothered to read, and the one signature my family forgot they needed. Welcome back to Family Revenge Stories New, the channel where quiet people keep the receipts and family learns that boundaries have a price. If stories about dignity, documents, and consequences are your thing, drop a comment and subscribe, because this one has a closing date you will not forget. I am an estate planning attorney. 12 years now. People assume that means I write wills for the elderly and nod solemnly at funerals. What it actually means is that I have spent my career watching families discover, in real time, that love and ownership are not the same thing. I draft the documents that decide who gets to keep the porch swing, and who gets nothing but a story about how close they came. I have learned to read a room the way other people read a contract, for the clause nobody wants to say out loud. 14 months before that Christmas, I buried my husband. Daniel was a high school chemistry teacher, the kind who kept a jar of gummy bears on his desk for the kids who got the hard questions right. He died on a Tuesday in October, quietly, the way he did most things, and I went back to work the following Monday because grief, I have found, does not honor a billable hour, and neither does anyone else's mortgage. My mother, Diane, has always run our family the way a landlord runs a building she doesn't live in, collecting what's owed, deferring the repairs. My sister Kayla orbited her like a moon that had given up on having its own light. My brother Todd showed up to things and left early, and I was the one who drove 2 hours each way to sit with my grandmother on chemo Tuesdays, who paid for the hospice bed, who signed for the packages nobody else was home to receive. Grandma Eleanor used to say I was the only one in the family who read the fine print of her own life. I didn't understand at the time that she meant it literally. The emotional arithmetic of my family was simple, and I ran it for 30 years without once checking the math. Showing up was love, and love was free, and anyone who kept track of what it cost was cold. I kept track. I have always kept track. It is, as it turns out, the only reason any of this comes out even. On December 23rd, at 6:47 p.m., my mother texted our family group chat a single line. Selling Grandma's house Monday. Kayla's helping with the walkthrough. No vote. No conversación. A closing date, delivered like a weather report. I didn't respond in the group chat. I took a screenshot. That is the whole of what 12 years in this profession does to a person. Somewhere between law school and my first contested estate, my hands started saving evidence before my heart finished processing the wound. Grandma Eleanor had been gone 11 weeks. Her house on Birchwood Lane had sat with the porch light on the whole time, because nobody had thought to turn it off, and nobody had thought to ask what the will actually said, because everyone already knew what it said. Everyone was wrong. At Christmas dinner, my mother smirked and told the table the house was sold, and something in that sentence, the tense of it, finally, as if the house had been an inconvenience she'd been patiently waiting out, sat wrong in my chest like a bone caught sideways. I took a sip of wine. I set the glass down without a sound. That's interesting, I said, because the house isn't yours to sell. The table went quiet the way rooms go quiet right before someone remembers they're supposed to be offended. My mother laughed it off, a short, brittle sound, and said I'd had too much wine. I hadn't. I excused myself before dessert, drove home in the dark, and sat at my kitchen table with my laptop and 11 weeks of documents I had been too grief-numb to fully open until that night. I read the recorded deed on the county assessor's site first. Then I read it again. Then I called the attorney who had handled Grandma's estate, a man named Philip Okonkwo, semi-retired, sharp as a paper cut, and asked him to meet me the following morning, because some things you do not want to learn alone at midnight over a laptop, even when you are the kind of person who reads fine print for a living. Philip's office smelled like old carpet and printer toner, and he had a way of sliding documents across a desk like he was dealing cards he already knew the outcome of. Your grandmother, he said, didn't leave a will. Not really. She left a trust. 1998. The Birchwood Trust. I already suspected this. I needed to hear him say the rest. The trust named Grandma's late husband as first trustee, then Grandma herself, and upon her death, a successor trustee, me. Not my mother. Not Kayla. Me, the granddaughter who drove 2 hours on chemo Tuesdays, named in ink 26 years before anyone had reason to think it would matter. The trust held the house itself, not as a probate asset the family could simply divide, but as a controlled asset requiring the trustee's signature, my signature, before any sale could legally close. My mother had found an old, superseded 2004 will in a shoebox in the hall closet, a document Grandma had written before the trust existed and never bothered to update because she assumed, correctly, that the trust made it irrelevant. My mother read 4 sentences of a document with no legal teeth and built a closing date around it. Philip slid a second document across the desk. A letter, handwritten, dated 8 months before Grandma died, kept in the same file as the trust, addressed to me by name. I read it once silently. Then I asked to be alone in the room for a minute, and Philip, being the kind of man who has watched this exact moment happen to 100 families, closed the door behind him without a word. The letter was 3 paragraphs. It said the house was never really about the house. It said she'd watched me become the kind of person who shows up without being asked and never once mentions the gas money, and that she wasn't going to let the rest of the family price that out of me after she was gone. The last line read, "The garden was always yours, Claire. Everything under it is just paperwork." I read that line 3 times. I did not cry, not in a way anyone would have seen. I folded the letter along its existing crease and put it back in its folder, and I understood, sitting in that chair, that the closing scheduled for Monday was not just premature. It was void. My mother and sister had signed a purchase agreement with a title company, using a decade-old power of attorney form that had expired the day Grandma died, on a house they did not have the legal authority to sell. I did not act yet. I drove home and read the trust 3 more times, cover to cover, the way you'd check a bridge twice before you let anyone drive across it. By New Year's Eve, word had reached my mother that the closing had a problem. Title companies do not love surprises, and mine had made a very polite, very unwelcome phone call to hers. She called me 11 times in 2 days. I let most of them go to voicemail. In the 2 I answered, she never once asked what the trust said. She asked when I could just sign whatever's needed, so the sale could still close by the 15th, because Kayla, she mentioned, had already put a deposit on a kitchen renovation with her half. Todd texted me separately. "Mom says you're being difficult about Grandma's house. LL, just sign it. It's family money." It was not family money. It had never been family money. It was, specifically and legally, a testamentary trust with one authorized signer, and that signer had just spent New Year's Eve rereading her grandmother's handwriting instead of attending anyone's party. Kayla showed up at my apartment on January 3rd, unannounced, wearing the coat Mom had bought her for Christmas with money that, I now understood, had never technically been hers to spend. She sat on my couch and told me I was punishing everyone for a technicality, that Grandma would have wanted the family to have the money without lawyer nonsense getting in the way, that I was choosing paperwork over people. I asked her one question. "What was the sale price you signed for?" She said $415. I already knew it was $415. I wanted to hear her say a number she had never once questioned or verified, a number she'd already spent in her head on cabinets. I didn't answer anything else. I walked her to the door, and after it closed, I called Philip and told him to send the letters, to the title company, to the buyer's agent, to my mother, formally on firm letterhead, stating the trust's authority and the closing's invalidity. If you've ever watched people who couldn't spare one afternoon suddenly find all the time in the world when money is involved, you already know exactly where this goes. Stick with me. My mother's response to Philip's letter was to organize a family dinner. Not a conversation, a production. She called it clearing the air, and invited an aunt I hadn't spoken to in 3 years, the kind of guest list you assemble when you want an audience for a verdict, not a discussion. I said yes. I brought a manila folder. The dinner was at my mother's house. In the dining room she'd redecorated with money she didn't have yet. Kayla arrived already flushed, like she'd rehearsed being wronged in the car. Todd sat at the far end, the way he always did when he wanted plausible deniability. My mother stood at the head of the table and gave what could only be described as a toast. To family, to moving forward, to letting go of things that don't matter anymore, like paper. She raised her glass like the matter was settled, and I was simply late to my own surrender. I'd like the floor, I said, before we move forward. She gestured for me to go ahead. The way you'd humor a child before bed, certain of exactly how this would end. I opened the folder. I laid the recorded 1998 trust deed on the table first, and read the line naming the successor trustee, out loud slowly, the way you'd read a diagnosis to someone who needed to hear every word. Then I laid the expired power of attorney beside it, the one they'd used at closing, and read its expiration clause, which predated Grandma's death by exactly none. The moment she died, that document became a piece of paper with no more legal force than a grocery list. My mother's face did the thing faces do when the story they've told themselves for 6 weeks meets a document that was never asked what it thought. I laid the title company's cancellation notice beside it. Then the buyer's forfeited deposit. $12,000 gone, because a contract signed without authority binds no one but the people who signed it. Then last I laid the letter. I did not read the whole thing. I read one line. The garden was always yours, Claire. Everything under it is just paperwork. I let it sit on the table without another word attached to it. The room went soft first, my aunt's hand over her mouth. Then emotional, Kayla's voice cracking as she said I'd humiliated her in front of everyone, that I'd let her spend money on cabinets she now had to return. Then loud, my mother standing, saying I'd always thought I was better than this family, that Grandma had obviously not been in her right mind, to leave the house tied up like this. Then something quieter and uglier, a low, flat threat about contesting the trust, hiring their own lawyer, making this very expensive for me. I answered each escalation with a smaller sentence than the one before it. To humiliation, I said. I didn't write the trust. I just read it. To the accusation of instability, I said. Philip has 3 witnesses and a notarized signing. You're welcome to try. To the threat, I said nothing at all. I just closed the folder. It was Todd at the far end of the table, who broke first, not loudly, just a quiet, "Mom, she signed it 4 years before she got sick. This isn't new." Nobody thanked him for it. Nobody forgave him for it either. He simply sat there, having said the true thing, in a family that had never quite made room for those. I stood to leave. My mother said my name like it was an accusation. I turned at the doorway and said the only thing I'd planned in advance. You didn't lose the house, Mom. You lost the ability to sell something that was never fully yours to sell. Grandma just made sure the paperwork agreed with what she actually meant. The sale never closed. The title company's cancellation was final by the end of January, and the deposit forfeiture cost my mother and Kayla $12,000 they had already, separately, spent. As trustee, I retained the house within the Birchwood Trust, exactly as the document required, with the $50,000 direct bequest to me processed cleanly through Philip's office by March. Kayla's kitchen renovation was canceled. The contractor kept half her deposit. She did not speak to me for 5 months. When she finally called, it wasn't an apology, it was a request for a loan, which I declined, calmly, the way you decline all requests once you've stopped confusing generosity with obligation. My mother hired her own attorney to explore contesting the trust and was told, in writing, that a validly executed 1998 trust naming a specific successor trustee is not overturned by a family's collective certainty, that it should have said something else. She dropped it within a month, Once the retainer invoice arrived. Todd and I talk more now than we ever did before. Not because he was a hero at that dinner. He wasn't, but because he was the only one willing to say a true sentence out loud. And it turns out that's a lower bar than I'd been taught to expect from my own family. And also the only one that actually matters. The letter lives in a fireproof box in my home office now, behind the folder with the trust deed, the same folder I brought to that dinner. I take it out sometimes, not for the legal language, just for the one line. I had it reframed in a small dark wood frame that sits on the bookshelf across from my desk. Not the whole page, just that sentence, in Grandma's own handwriting, photographed and printed. It doesn't need the rest of the paperwork around it to mean what it means. I did not sell the house. I fixed the porch light, which had been left on for 11 weeks, and I finally turned it off. I used part of the bequest to fund a small scholarship at the community college where Daniel taught, in his name, for students studying to become teachers themselves. The kind of quiet, unglamorous work that never once shows up on anyone's balance sheet, but holds up everything else. I did not tell my family I'd done it. It wasn't for them. It never had been. This was never about the house, or the $415,000 my mother had already spent in her head before the ink on anything was dry. It was about a woman who spent the last months of her life making sure the people who loved her without conditions weren't left holding a debt they never signed up for. I didn't win anything, and I didn't take anything that wasn't already mine on paper 26 years before anyone needed it to be. I simply stopped paying interest on a story that was never true. Grandma used to say the fine print is just love, written down so nobody can talk you out of it later. I believe her more each year. If this reminded you that quiet people keep the receipts, and that boundaries are allowed even with blood, take that as your sign. Go find the document that's actually true, not the one everyone's agreed to believe. Tell someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.